Hi everyone, welcome back to our journey through the biblical storyline. This week we're diving into chapter 4 of Robert's God's Big Picture, which covers what he calls the partial kingdom. We've been reading through Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, and the prophets, along with Longman's introduction to the historical books and prophets. This phase covers Israel from entering the promised land through exile, and it's absolutely packed with drama, tragedy, and hope. So, what exactly is the particular kingdom? The key word here is partial, and Roberts uses this term intentionally during this period. Israel finally receives many of the promises God made to Abraham. They get the land, they become the nation, they have a king, and God's presence dwells in the temple in Jerusalem. But here's the crucial point. It's all only a partial fulfillment. The kingdom is established, but it's marred by sin. The kings are flawed. The nation is rebellious. The blessings are experienced, but the full permanent blessing that is promised, where all nations would be blessed and sin would be defeated, that's still outstanding. So this phase shows us that the kingdom, in part, not yet in its perfect final form. Longman helps us understand that the historical books aren't just recording events. They're doing theological history, showing how God's covenant faithfulness meets human failure at every turn. Let me walk you through the storyline, which unfolds in several major movements from our Bible reading. First, conquest and settlement. In the book of Joshua, Israel finally enters the promised land. Under Joshua, they experience victory after victory. Jericho falls. The land is divided among tribes. But even here, the conquest is incomplete. The Canaanites remain, and Joshua's farewell warning in chapter 24 foreshadows the trouble ahead. Second, the cycle of the Judges through Samuel. This is the darkest period before the monarchy. Judges sow a devastating cycle. Israel sins, God sends oppressors. Israel cries out, God raises a judge to deliver them. Peace, then sin again. It's a downward spiral, and Judges 21 gives the heartbreaking summary. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Third, the monarchy, 1 Samuel through 1 Kings. Israel demands a king, like the nations, which is problematic because God was supposed to be their king. Samuel fails. David rises again, the man after God's own heart, and God makes another covenant with him, promising an eternal throne. David's reign is the high point, but even he falls into terrible sin with Bathsheba. Solomon builds the temple, God's glorious dwelling place, but Solomon's heart turns to other gods. Fourth, the divided kingdom in exile. 1 Kings 12 through 2 Kings. The nation slips, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Kings lead the people into idolatry. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, Amos, and Habakkuk are sent to call them back, warning of judgment. But the people refuse to listen. Eventually, Assyria destroys the kingdom in 722 BC, and Babylon conquers Judah, destroys the temple, and takes the people into exile in 586 BC. It is catastrophic. Now, how does this flow from what we've studied in previous weeks? This is where the storyline gets rich. Week 1 gave us the perfect kingdom, creation where God dwelt with humanity in perfect relationship. Then the rebellious kingdom, the fall, where sin shattered that relationship. Week 2 introduced the prophesied kingdom, God's covenant with Abraham promising land, descendants, and blessings. Then the Exodus, the giving of the law, the tabernacle, God redeeming a people and welcoming to dwell among them. Now the partial kingdom. We see those promises beginning to be fulfilled, but partially. Let me trace the connections. The land promised to Abraham, they get it under Joshua, but they never fully possess it or drive out the inhabitants. And eventually they lose it in exile. The descendants promised to Abraham. They became a great nation under David and Solomon, but the nation splits and is decimated by foreign powers. Blessings to all nations. There are glimpses. Ruth and Moabite join Israel. The queen of Sheba visits Solomon. Naaman the Syrian is healed, but the nations aren't streaming to Zion yet. God's dwelling with his people. The tabernacle becomes the temple in Jerusalem, but God's glory departs from the temple before the destruction. Ezekiel 10 through 11 shows this powerfully. Even the Davidic covenant, God's promise of an eternal king from David's line, seems shattered when the last king is led away from chains. Roberts emphasizes that the partial kingdom shows us both the glory of what God promised and the tragedy of human sin that prevents its full realization. Finally, why does understanding the partial kingdom matter for the holistic big picture of the Bible? Let me give you 4 reasons. First, it shows us that human kingship is not the answer. Israel's best kings, David, Hezekiah, Josiah, point towards what a godly king should be, but every single one fails. The kingship itself becomes corrupted. This creates a longing for a different kind of king, one who will rule perfectly. Second, the prophets become essential. During this period, the prophets aren't just predicting the future, they're interpreting the present in light of God's covenant. They call God's people back to faithfulness, and when judgment comes, they explain why. But here's the key: they also keep hope alive. Even as they announce judgment, they promise restoration. Look at Isaiah 52 to 54. The suffering servant who will bear the sins of the people. Jeremiah 31, the new covenant written on hearts. Ezekiel 16, God's covenant faithfulness despite Israel's unfaithfulness. Hosea, God's relentless love pursuing his unfaithful bride. Amos, justice rolling down like waters. These prophets are planting seeds that will bloom in the New Testament. Third, the partial kingdom establishes patterns that point forward. The Davidic king, the temple, the sacrifices, the Passover, all these are designed by God as shadows of something greater to come. They're not the final reality, but they teach us what to look for. Fourth, it creates desperate hope. By the end of 2 kings, everything seems lost. The land is gone, the king is gone, the temple is destroyed, the people is scattered. But here's the thing: God's promises haven't failed. The people failed. And if God's plan depends on human faithfulness, there's no hope. But as we'll see in the next phase, God's plan depends on his faithfulness. And that's what makes the rest of the story so incredible. So the partial kingdom leaves us a question. If human kings can't save us, if the land can be lost, if the temple can be destroyed, then how will God fulfill his promises? That question carries us on into next week, where we'll see the prophetic kingdom and the hope that sustains God's people through the exile. Thank you for watching. See you next time.